So thank you, Cam. So I want to say how happy I am to be here at PREMUS. And as Cam said, I'll be presenting the results of the NIOSH upper limb consortium studies. And first, though, if you will indulge me for a moment, I wanted to talk about why I think PREMUS is an important conference and how it's been useful in developing my career and I think some of the research that I've been involved in. So as Cam said, the first scientific conference on prevention of work-related musculoskeletal disorders was held in 1992 in Stockholm, organized by Mats Hagberg and the late Åsa Kilbom. It actually wasn't in Stockholm. It was on this island that was a long ways from Stockholm. And that was important for me because as a postdoctoral fellow, I did not have enough money to stay in the conference hotel. So I was staying at the home of a friend and had to take 2 trains and a bus every day to get to the conference and back. But it was very much worth it. The themes then were on outcomes, exposures, and interventions. This was the first time that I'd been in a room with a couple hundred other people who were interested in the same thing that I was interested in. And a talk then by Barbara Silverstein really helped seal my interest in musculoskeletal disorders. And she talked about the design of intervention studies. This is when I really realized that unlike cancer epidemiology, which is the field I was coming from, with MSDs you could actually do intervention studies and see the results within a professional lifetime. So the ability to do interventions was really exciting to me. In Montreal was the first time we saw large representation by the Institute for Work and Health. That meeting was I think, important to me because I realized the value of the informal interactions that we have at this meeting to one's career. So I went out to a bar with Dave Rempel. I'm sure he picked the bar because he does very well at picking restaurants. And we talked about carpal tunnel syndrome and the difficulty of case definitions. So I left that meeting clutching a bar napkin on which were scribbled the outline for what eventually became this paper on the consensus criteria for the classification of carpal tunnel syndrome, on which Mats and Al Francois and others in the room participated. And this is where the case definitions for the studies I'll show you later originated. Helsinki in 1998 was the first time that PREMUS was held in conjunction with what was then called the International Society of Epidemiology and Occupational Health. And so now it seems very normal that when we go to ICO or go to EPICO, there's a very large representation of musculoskeletal disorders. This was not normal 20 years ago. So this was, I think, the first time when musculoskeletal disorder research was presented, merged with a major epidemiology conference that looked at other risk factors in occupational health. For me, this meeting was important because I was still struggling to get started. I had this participatory ergonomics intervention that I could not get published in the United States. So I was having a lot of trouble getting this published. And got to Helsinki, and much to my surprise and delight, was chosen to be one of the papers highlighted to the Finnish press. So there was a press conference. As you can see by the title here, this was about participatory ergonomics in hospital orderlies. And it was, again, nice to be in a group of people who sort of appreciated the work, even though I think at home maybe you were having more trouble getting traction. And this is probably something that most of us have encountered. So in addition to seeing many old friends here, and I mean that both in terms of how long I've known you and how gray your hair is, it's really wonderful to see so many young people in the audience here today as well. So I think the PREMUS conferences, of which I've been to every single one, have all been useful because there's been great formal presentation of cutting-edge research in my field and then in related fields. And I think even more important have been the informal interactions, commonly accompanied by culturally appropriate food and drink. And it's this sense, I think, of collaboration and community, of being in a group of people who understand what you do and have great ideas, that I think has been a really important thing for me to look forward every 3 years. So this is why I'm really happy to be here. This has been an important conference for me, and I'm really happy to share the work that we've done in the NIOSH Consortium with you. Okay, so enough reminiscing. Today I'm going to give you an overview of the NIOSH Upper Extremity Consortium study, talk about the design, the main findings. I want to compare our results to those of the octopus studies that were done in Italy, and give some thoughts on future trends in musculoskeletal diseases research. So I wanted to acknowledge my co-investigators and collaborators in the NIOSH Upper Extremity Consortium study. So this has involved a whole lot of people over many years. And here we have the main investigators that have been involved in the pooled analysis that I'll be talking about. I particularly wanted to recognize David Rempel, who chaired the pooling efforts and has kept this group together moving forward in a common pathway for a long number of years. So first, why should we study carpal tunnel syndrome? Why has this disorder received a lot of attention, I think, particularly in the United States? It's the most common entrapment neuropathy, compression of the median nerve in the carpal tunnel. It's a very common upper extremity surgery. So in the United States, almost twice as many people get carpal tunnel release as get surgery for rotator cuff repair in this age group of 45 to 64. It's associated with large financial burden in the compensation systems, a high cost per case, and accounts for some significant amount of residual disability even after treatment. And has become in some ways a model for other upper extremity musculoskeletal disorders. So some of the lessons we've learned from exposure and outcomes assessment have been applicable to the study of other upper extremity disorders. So there are also some problems that make studying carpal tunnel syndrome quite different. It's common enough to be a societal problem, but it's rare enough to make it difficult to study in small groups. You really have to get a large cohort together to collect enough cases to be able to draw good exposure-response associations. The estimates of the prevalence and incidence of CTS vary widely depending on the case definition that is used and also depending on whether you're doing active or passive surveillance. So we see 2 orders of magnitude difference in case definitions for carpal tunnel syndrome depending on how it is defined. Multiple exposures are thought to be relevant. Physical exposures including force, repetition, posture, and vibration. And again, unlike cancer epidemiology, where we were doing studies that often were looking at one exposure that you could measure in the air at a workplace, you presume everyone is breathing the same air, and we used very crude exposure measures successfully in cancer epidemiology. In MSD epidemiology, we have multiple factors, highly time variant, a great deal of inter-individual variation, and they work together in ways that we don't really understand. There are also important personal risk factors for carpal tunnel syndrome, predominantly age, body mass index, and gender, that have made the delineation of risk between work exposures and personal exposures at times difficult to tease out. And this has been one thing, but certainly not the only thing, that has contributed to the highly politicized controversies over the causation of CTS and other upper extremity disorders that we've seen play out in the US and some other countries. So the rationale for the NIOSH study, which as Cam said was conceived in around the year 2000, was that although we had strong support in the literature for increase of CTS associated both with personal factors and with work factors, at the time few studies had rigorously evaluated CTS measuring both detailed personal and detailed work-related exposures. Also, the exposure-response relationships were not well defined, and the ability to do attributable risk looking at work and personal exposures, we really lacked the data to do that in a meaningful way. So the studies began recruiting subjects in 2001, and although subject recruitment has been over for some years now, we continue to analyze these data. Here's a map of the universities and agencies that were involved in the study. So we had Seattle, San Francisco, Utah, Milwaukee, Iowa, St. Louis, Missouri, and then NIOSH in Cincinnati. So we had study sites they were centered around 7 states here. These studies all had common features. We assessed both personal risk factors and work-related risk factors, attempted to quantify the relationships between exposures and outcomes. We used rigorous case definitions and obtained individual level exposures on all the workers. The detailed data that we collected included questionnaires or interviews on each worker, individual level exposure information that was done at baseline and then repeated with job changes, structured physical exams, and nerve conduction studies measuring both median and ulnar conduction across the wrist. The symptom questionnaires or interviews, the nerve conduction studies, and the physical examinations were repeated over time, and there was longitudinal follow-up of 3 to 7 years in the individual studies. So then the fun really began. So each of these individual studies then, we went through an effort starting formally in 2010 to pool the data, both the outcome data and the exposure data, to form from one large cohort that could be analyzed. This turned out to be a lot more work than we thought it would be at the beginning. So we had an outcomes committee and then an exposure committee that had visited each study site, took a very detailed look at what data were collected from each individual study, and then we worked towards common data elements that allowed us to define a common case definition and then a common set of exposure metrics. So in total, we had 4,321 workers. The range of workers in each study, in the smallest study was 346. In the largest of the 6 studies was 1,219. We recruited subjects from 55 different companies in 10 U.S. states, predominantly in production, food processing, some in healthcare, construction, service, and technical industries. Our common case definition for carpal tunnel syndrome required symptoms of numbness, burning, tingling, or pain in 1 or more of digits 1, 2, and 3, and median neuropathy, which we defined as sensory latency peaks of more than 3.7 milliseconds, motor latency of 4.5, or a median ulnar sensory difference of greater than 0.85 milliseconds. And you wouldn't believe how long we discussed the difference between 0.8 and 0.85 milliseconds and other such factors. And some of the previous publications that have come out have looked at the effect, actually, which can be quite large, on the number of cases by making relatively small changes in the case definition. How many fingers do you count? Does it have to be 1 or 2? Does it have to be a specific finger? And where you put the cut points for nerve conduction. So then the biomechanical exposures, we assessed 4 main exposures: force, repetition, posture, and percent time, and then some combinations of these exposures. Briefly, we assessed force by using the Borg CR10 scale, either the worker-completed CR10 scale or the analyst-completed scale. Repetition, we used analyst rating of the hand activity level, and then also measured total repetition rate by video analysis. Posture was done by video analysis, and we picked 30 degrees of flexion or extension as the cut point. We then used video analysis to calculate the percent time spent in total hand exertions, as well as then looking at a subset of that total exertion time, which was the percentage of time spent in forceful exertions, which we defined as greater than 9 newtons of pinch force or 45 newtons of power grip. And this is a point we'll come back to. And then we also combined repetition and force, which was the repetition rate, but for these forceful movements. Most of you are familiar with the Borg CR10 scale, which can be rated by the worker on the left or by an analyst on the right as a rating of peak force incurred in a specific task. The hand activity scale on the bottom is a 0 to 10 ranking performed by an analyst rating the frequency and speed of hand exertions. So for the video analysis, We used multimedia video task analysis to look at the flexion extension, force repetition rate, and time spent in all hand exertions. There was up to 10 minutes of video per task, 30 frames per second, and we coded those frames to arrive at these estimates for the amount of time spent in different tasks. I was very happy that I was not part of the video coding. So to date, these studies have produced about more than 80 publications. We've done 13 publications that have used this pooled data set that have looked both at exposure methods, case definitions, prevalence, and incidence. And today I'm going to focus on the 5 incidence studies that have used the pooled consortium data. So these studies have somewhat different numbers of subjects studied because in the individual studies we collected slightly different data. And so as we've done different definitions of outcomes or exposures, the number of eligible subjects in the pooled data set has changed slightly. All of these studies had a similar study recruitment profile. Here I'm showing the flow chart from the Capellish study. So we enrolled 4,321 subjects at the beginning. At baseline, we excluded subjects who had prevalent carpal tunnel syndrome. So people who met our case definition already at baseline were prevalent cases. They were not at risk for developing incident carpal tunnel syndrome, so we excluded at baseline these subjects. Then we lost some to follow-up. We had incomplete outcome data, or we had incomplete or missing exposure data that, again, was dependent on which specific exposures we were looking at in that particular study. Statistical analysis primarily was done through categorical splits on the baseline exposure distribution. We used Cox proportional hazard models to do most of our analyses. And it's important to note that all of our analyses were adjusted for age, body mass index, and study site, as well as adjusted for non-overlapping biomechanical exposures. So, for instance, we looked at peak force after adjusting for posture, repetition, and time spent in all exertions. We looked at total repetition rate, adjusting for posture and peak force. And then when we looked at the combinations of force and repetition, we adjusted for posture. And this was an attempt to tease out the individual or the independent contributions of the different exposures to carpal tunnel syndrome. So demographic characteristics of this cohort, they were about half male, about half Caucasian, just under 40 for the mean age. The mean body mass index was similar to that of the general American workforce, about 28.6, and about 1/3 of the workers met criteria for obesity, body mass index over 30, again similar to the general American working population. About 1/4 of them smoked. There was an appreciable percentage that had not completed high school. On average, they'd been in their job for 6.5 years, and it will come back to that point as well. And for the overall cohort, the incidence of carpal tunnel syndrome was 2.3 cases per 100 person years. Hazard ratios for the demographic factors, as expected, we found that there was a slightly higher hazard ratio in female workers, and there was increased risk with age, with body mass index, and no real contribution from diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, or thyroid diseases. About 10% of our subjects had one of these disorders, but this was not significant in this generally healthy working population. And although we've shown age and BMI here as categorical cuts, these, if we did these as continuous variables, there was a monotonic, essentially linear increase with risk with increasing age and increasing body mass index. So now we come to the fun part. Here are where we'll show you the results from the exposure analysis in the pooled data. So these next few slides are from the paper by Carissa Harris in 2015. So here's posture adjusted for age, gender, body mass index, and other exposures. Our dichotomous cut point for extension was more or less than 5%, and for flexion more or less than 1%. We just did not have that many workers who did prolonged or high duration flexion. And when controlled for other exposures, we found no effect for posture in this study as an independent risk factor. Peak hand force, on the other hand, whether rated by the worker on the top or whether peak force was rated by the analyst on the bottom, we found a strong dose-dependent increase in hazard ratio associated with these peak forces, which again was 9 newtons for pinch and 45 newtons for power grip. When we looked at hand repetition, and I think this is where things start to get interesting. So when we look at hand activity level rated by the analyst, we do see some increase, particularly in the middle exposure range and in the top of the exposure range. And so a point we'll come back to a little later is hand activity level a pure measure of repetition? I think the answer is going to be no. When we looked at repetition rate from the video, we found no increase in risk with repetition alone. So this is repetition controlled for force. Did not budge the results. However, when we looked at forceful repetition rate with video analyzed repetition and with worker or analyst rated force, again, we get a nice dose-response relationship. In addition to looking at repetition rate as a measure of time, we also looked at duty cycle. And as shown in this example, you could have the same repetition rate and the same force, but have very different exposure profiles. So we used the data from the video analysis to look at the percentage of time spent in any activity and the percentage of time spent in forceful activity, and found results very similar to repetition. Time spent doing any hand activity showed no increased risk of carpal tunnel syndrome, whereas time spent in forceful activity showed a strong dose-dependent relationship. So those were categorical analyses. Just to show you some of the analyses of these results mapped as continuous variables. So we looked at the hazard ratio for peak force. We get sort of a monotonically increasing pattern here with a bit of a shoulder, at least a hint of a shoulder at the upper end of the distribution. And there really are not that many workers who are doing a lot of work in this upper range. So you can see from the bottom scale we have very few workers in the upper part of the distribution, and the confidence intervals get much wider on that right-hand side of this graph. But a clear increase in a continuous fashion for increases in peak force. Similarly, for forceful repetition rate, so the combination of force and repetition increased linear risk. And for the time spent in forceful exertion, again, we get an increase until we seem to get a peak and a bit of a drop-off at the right-hand end of the distribution. And we'll come back to that point as well. So these are all measures of force or repetition or time spent in force. When we look at repetition alone, again, almost no matter how we look at it, we do not see an increase in risk for carpal tunnel syndrome with increases in repetition. So the upper right is the hand activity level that's been computed by repetition rates using Rob Radwin's method. Duty cycle, so the time spent in movement of any kind, or the frequency, we see either flat or slightly downtrending lines when these exposures are adjusted for force. So that's one set of our incidence studies, and now I wanted to switch to looking at the threshold limit value for hand wrist exposures. So most of you are familiar with this metric that was created in 2001 by ACGIH. It combined peak force on the vertical axis with hand activity level on the horizontal axis. There's an action limit, which is the green area above which employers were supposed to look at activity and make changes. And then there was a threshold limit value, which defines the red area, which was thought to be exposures that were hazardous for health. And these were developed primarily on a psychophysical basis, developed in most of the data coming from University of Michigan. So the Octopus study, which was done in Italy by the two major publications from that, by Bonfiglioli and by Violante, have reported on the risk factor of carpal tunnel syndrome using the HAL-TLV as their exposure measure. So this Octopus study was the prospective cohort study in manufacturing and service workers, 4,232 in their cohort. They got ratings of peak force and hand activity level performed by trained observers at the level of the individual task. Their case definition was very similar to the one that we used in our studies, and they observed 126 cases of carpal tunnel syndrome over more than 8,800 person years in the longer-term follow-up. So here we see the results of three studies. The first is the shorter-term follow-up of the Octopus study. The middle is the longer-term follow-up of the Octopus study. And on the right is our pooled NIOSH Consortium data. If we use exposures below the action limit as the referent, then we see that exposures that are above the action limit but below the threshold limit value show fairly similar increased risks for carpal tunnel syndrome across the short-term and long-term follow-up of Octopus and in our consortium study. Along the bottom then, in the initial follow-up of the Octopus study, there was an additional increase in TLV, but not on long-term follow-up of that study. And in our study, we saw a slight fall-off in risk with longer-term follow-up. But on the whole, these are quite similar results. We've also looked at other ways to try to model peak force and hand activity level to better describe risk of carpal tunnel syndrome. So this is a somewhat complicated diagram. On the vertical axis, we have peak force. On the horizontal axis, we have hand activity level. The bubbles represent the number of workers in each of the number of workers at each force and activity level intersection that we saw in our NIOSH study. And then the blue line is the action limit and the red line, the TLV. So a couple things from this graph. One is there are a whole lot of workers who are exposed at levels higher than the threshold limit value. Another then is that there are a lot of workers who are exposed in this intermediate area between the action limit and the TLV. And then these, by changing the formula somewhat that links peak force to hand activity level, Jay Kapelish created these bars of equal risk. So we have hazard ratio of 3, 2.5, 2 coming on down. So we noticed that a lot of the workers, even with this adjusted model or even with the current definition of action limit and TLV, that people above the action limit but below the TLV are still at much increased risk of carpal tunnel syndrome. So these results are consistent from two large cohorts, that the threshold limit value on this combination of force and hand activity predicts carpal tunnel syndrome, that some calculations using somewhat different formulas can be even more strongly predictive of risk, and that the current action limit and TLV are too high to adequately protect workers from carpal tunnel syndrome. Both studies also found some nonlinearity of risk, with the highest exposures sometimes associated with the same or even lower risk as intermediate exposures. And in both studies, we've thought that this was, at least in part, due to a survivor effect. And we found some evidence for a healthy survivor effect in both studies. In the NIOSH Consortium study, workers who were in their first 3 years of work had a significantly higher risk of carpal tunnel syndrome for the same exposures as those who had longer job tenures. And then in the Italian study, there were higher rates of CTS among those who decreased exposures during the time of follow-up, suggesting that people are getting symptomatic and reducing exposures at work. Hand activity level, I think, is quite interesting. We think of it as strictly as a measure of repetition. In the octopus study, hand activity level increased risk of CTS by 37% for each 1 unit increase in hand activity level. We saw a smaller increase in risk, but still an increased risk in our study for hand activity level. But the hand activity level is strongly correlated with peak force. So the correlation was over 0.4 in the octopus study, a little bit under 0.2 in the NIOSH study. I think this suggests that it's not a pure measure of repetition. And it's likely that analysts have some minimum level of force that's a threshold before they will score something as a hand activity. When we computed HAL just based purely on video-coded repetitions using the method that Rob has developed, we found no association with CTS and very, very minimal correlation with peak force. So I think HAL, actually, as it's being used currently, is actually a composite measure to some extent of activity and force. So other pooled findings from from the consortium study, we did a study looking at median nerve conduction irrespective of symptoms as the outcome, and as a way to try to reduce any potential confounding from symptom reporting that was not related to carpal tunnel syndrome, and found the same associations with biomechanical exposures as we found using the case definition that incorporated both symptoms and nerve conduction. We've also applied a job exposure matrix within the cohort to look at past exposures. So the workers that we enrolled in our study, have all had previous jobs as well, and to try to account for exposures that people had brought with them or disorders they brought with them into our study, we used a job exposure matrix to look at historical exposure, estimate historical exposures, which we could not directly observe. And again, found similar outcomes for similar risk factors for prevalent CTS as we found for incident CTS, in particular a combination of force and repetitious work or handling objects. We have also seen some evidence for psychosocial factors as risk factors in our studies. Decision latitude and social support seem to be protective among workers with low biomechanical exposure, and high psychosocial demand seem to increase risk of CTS among those with high biomechanical exposure. There's some evidence of confounding with repetition and time spent in exertion and these psychosocial factors. So Carissa Harris-Adamson will be presenting these results later in the conference. So, summary of the consortium findings. In our cohort, we found that carpal tunnel syndrome was associated with peak hand force, forceful hand repetition, and percent time in forceful hand exertions after controlling for all relevant individual factors. In our cohort, biomechanical factors that were not associated with CTS included total hand repetition rate, total hand activity, or wrist posture. And so for at least these production and service jobs, which are among the highest risk jobs overall for CTS, these findings would suggest that interventions should focus on reductions in peak force and the duration of forceful hand activity. Strengths of the consortium, prospective design, very large study, varied workplaces, good participation rate, highly specific case criteria, quantitative exposure measurements, blinding of the clinicians to the exposures and blinding of the clinical picture to the ergonomists who were doing exposure assessments. We measured both personal and workplace factors, and were able to create more detailed exposure response associations and more detailed exposure response graphs than we've previously had due to the detailed exposure and the large number of cases. There were, however, a number of limitations to these studies. These were 6 different studies with somewhat different designs that were pooled on the common data elements for outcomes and exposures. Our exposures were based on limited windows of observation. We had relatively few low exposure jobs and deliberately tried to keep highly variable exposure jobs out of the study. So the results will not be as relevant for variable jobs or for low exposure jobs. We had limited data on vibration exposure. We were not able to meaningfully assess vibration. And we had few workers with very long durations of extreme flexion or extension. So our cut points for those were relatively low. So we can't speak directly to that small subset of jobs that has very prolonged flexion or extension at the wrist. So next steps within the consortium. I think for us, there's a lot of data left to mine. And any resemblance between the consortium investigators and any particular dwarf seen in this picture are purely coincidental. I call dopey. So we want to analyze other endpoints, including wrist tendinitis and elbow and shoulder disorders, for which we have the outcome in physical exam data, but which will require some significant work on exposures. We're looking at functional outcomes of workers as an important outcome that may be affected by exposure. And then we're hoping to combine our data with that from other large cohorts to look at comparisons across studies and then to increase the variability of exposure that we have available for analysis. So that's the summary for the NIOSH Consortium studies. And I want to use just the last few minutes here to talk about a couple of other ideas or trends about musculoskeletal disorder research and where I think that we're going, coming back to these themes from the first PREMUS of outcomes, exposures, and interventions. So one of the things that we learned from this study is that longitudinal studies are very expensive and are very labor-intensive. So I think we have developed a great trove of data similar to the octopus study, who I'm sure also found their study to be expensive and very labor-intensive. These types of studies also have right and left truncation, so we may have healthy worker survivor effects that have attenuated the observed exposures in our study. And then when we lose people to follow-up when they change jobs, we lose the ability to obtain exposure information and often lose the ability to track them. So that is, I think, looking for more efficient ways to do longitudinal studies, and we'll touch on that in a moment. Outcome assessment, we should think about whether we're measuring the most important outcomes in our epi studies. Exposure assessment, to do it in the sort of detail that we have done it in these studies is also quite expensive and labor intensive. So how can we do that more efficiently, and how do we do exposures that can address variable jobs? And then finally, I've been thinking a lot recently about how we translate the results of our risk factor studies into interventions more effectively. How do we design our studies so the results are more likely to be disseminated? So I'll just comment briefly on these points. So first, I think for outcomes. So most of our studies, we have used case definitions that are meant to parallel clinical diagnoses. So symptoms, physical signs. I think that's been important to have case definitions that were recognizable to clinicians as the diseases that they're treating. But we should probably be incorporating more worker-centered outcomes, pain, function, and work limitation, and more employer-centered outcomes like productivity, cost, and quality of work created by their workers. I think the workers and the employers don't care so much about what the disease is called. They care about what they're able to do and how much it's going to cost to either provide treatment or provide a replacement workers. We should probably also be making more use of registry studies. Electronic health records are now incorporating a lot of patient-reported outcomes like pain and function. I think by more tightly working with health systems that are collecting some of the data that we would like to have, we can do studies more efficiently. And here's one example. So this is an iPad that has a short adaptive questionnaire that looks at pain and functional status. This was developed by the U.S. National Institute of Health called PREMUS. It's a whole set of patient-reported outcome instruments. And what's nice about the adaptive design is it skips questions depending on the question you answered. So the average time to complete this is less than 3 minutes. Patients do this in the waiting room. This has been implemented in our orthopedics clinics at our hospital in St. Louis, and we're now getting 8,000 completed questionnaires per month. So essentially, 99-point-something% of all the patients coming for initial or follow-up orthopedic visits are completing this. This is incorporated into the medical record. It's available to the clinicians. And we're now looking at how we can use this initially to study recovery trajectories and return to work, but potentially to study etiology as a way to take advantage of a very large pool of patient-reported outcomes in people who have upper extremity, low back, and lower extremity disorders. Similarly to outcomes, I think we need to embrace some of the new approaches to exposure assessment. So we have a lot of new technologies that are coming down the line. We're going to hear about several of them at this meeting. I think the wearable inertial sensors are potentially a huge step forward in our ability to do epidemiology, particularly of highly variable jobs. I'm old enough to remember when you had to have 30 wires connected to a very large box on a patient if you wanted to study motion, and someone wearing a large backpack with a keyboard attached running around chasing the worker from the original Music Nortalia study. So now you can paste something onto someone's wrist or onto their thigh and leave it there for a week, and then download the data and find out sort of 24/7 what their activity has been. So I think using these new technologies will cause another problem for us, which is how do you manage these very large data sets that are now coming from inertial sensors in a way that makes sense and that is validated against some of our more traditional exposure assessments. I was really excited to see the couple papers that Rob Radwin has put out recently that talk about automated coding of videos. There's been a couple of studies showing just how much it costs to code videotape, and we all know that every 30 seconds of video takes some very much longer increment of time than that to code. So automated coding, I think, will be a great leap forward for our ability to get large quantities of direct observation to measure repetition, probably force, and possibly posture in a way that is much less labor intensive. I think job exposure matrices also have a role here, although they do not provide very precise exposure estimates. They can provide exposure estimates for historical exposures and then allow us to add exposure information to large outcome registries that have no exposure information in them. And then finally, I think the threshold limit value for HAL and other less labor-intensive assessment tools appear to be valid and usable for workplace prevention. I think these are the type of tools that we need to be validating to put in the hands of practitioners, tools that they can actually use and that are linked to good data on outcomes. I think our approaches to intervention is not easy, and those who have done intervention studies realize why there are not more of them, because they are really logistically, politically, financially, and in almost every other way difficult. But I think we need to build a case here for urgency, and this is where the risk factor epi can help, is showing that really better driving home the message that MSD are a major source of morbidity, disability, and cost. And although we like to stay in our lanes as academics and publish the papers in the journals, those aren't read by policymakers or employers. And I think helping to drive this message that it's healthcare costs in general, our national disability systems, and our national economies that are being affected by musculoskeletal disorders. We need to provide practitioners with better tools, both to identify and to reduce the exposures associated with disease. And so validation of sort of pragmatic exposure assessment tools and testing of practical interventions for exposure reduction. And then finally, I think focusing on the most important exposures in the highest risk groups, so prolonged and repeated forceful hand exertions. So computer users aren't the high risk group for carpal tunnel syndrome. And if for this particular disorder, if we want to reduce it, we need to be focusing on laborers, industrial workers, and workers who have more intensive hand demands in their jobs. And then, as I think my last idea here, there's been a lot of innovation in the last few years in clinical trial design. And I think who have faced the same problems of how expensive it is to test new therapies or treatments. And I think we have things that we can borrow from there. And this is one of the most exciting studies I've read in the last 3 or 4 years, discussed randomized registry trials. So this is a way of conducting randomized experiments using electronic health records or existing patient registries, allows rapid recruitment and good follow-up at very low cost. So this was a study done in Iceland and Sweden. They recruited from about 30 hospitals and emergency rooms, people who were presenting to the hospital with an acute myocardial infarction. They managed to randomize them and do 3-month follow-up for a marginal cost of $50 per subject. So major 7,000-person randomized controlled trial that has resulted in a change in practice. It showed no benefit at 3-month and then a year follow-up, no benefit for doing this thrombectomy in the course of an acute MI. So if we can do registry studies for people in the midst of having a heart attack, we should be able to do similar efficient registry studies for people presenting with low back pain or epicondylitis or carpal tunnel syndrome. So I think working with our colleagues who are doing clinical trials could help us do large longitudinal studies and even intervention studies in a way that's more efficient. And I think the important thing here is to translate our work into prevention. This quote, "If we wait until we're ready, we'll be waiting for the rest of our lives." It sounds to me like something that's on one of those motivational posters, with a cat. But this is actually from the book A Series of Unfortunate Events. And I think, again, those who've done intervention studies realize it's easy to say that's much harder to do it. So I think a step we can definitely take is to keep thinking about how our work is going to be disseminated or translated into the hands of people who are in the trenches and can actually make changes in workplaces. How do we help them measure exposures? How do we help them decide what is a dangerous exposure? And how do we then show them the pathway to make interventions? We're nothing if not persistent. And I think that the field we've tackled here is a very big one. Again, prevention is much harder, I think, in musculoskeletal disorders. Again, in cancer epi, it was easy. You say, that thing causes disease, get rid of that thing. MSDs, it's hard to get rid of hard work. So I think there are both messaging issues as well as technical issues that we need to face. So with that, I want to say thank you to the organizers for inviting me, for my colleagues for working with me for the last 20-something years and providing support and collaboration in this group, and to the people, the faculty and staff and students in my lab who do most of the work that enables me to stand up here. Thanks for your attention.
I'm Rahman Shiri from Finnish Institute of Occupational Health. Thank you for your excellent overview. I have a comment and a question. My comment is that the most important risk factor for carpal tunnel syndrome is a square-shaped hand.
I'm sorry, what?
A square-shaped hand or a wrist ratio more than 0.7 or it's measured by wrist ratio or wrist palm ratio. 1/4 to 1/3 of variation in carpal tunnel syndrome can be explained by wrist square-shaped wrist. One of the reasons that carpal tunnel syndrome is more prevalent in women than men is due to the high wrist ratio. And if nerve conduction study is necessary to confirm carpal tunnel syndrome, I think any study on risk factor for carpal tunnel syndrome also is required to include at least one hand anthropometric measures, like wrist ratio or wrist palm ratio. There are unpublished studies showing that there is an interaction between obesity and wrist ratio. There are also interaction between high hand force, wrist posture, and also wrist ratio.
Thanks. So thanks for your comments. So I think that the risk ratio has been looked at, and I think in a number of studies, including some of the publications from the individual consortium sites. It has been found, I think in some, although not necessarily all studies, to be a predictor. At least in our work, I believe we looked at this, I think in 2008, and didn't find that it made a significant difference in the basically in the relationship of the work-related exposures to the eventual outcome. So we've reported it in some of our studies, but have not reported it in all of them.
And the question is, you found no association between wrist posture and carpal tunnel syndrome, but there is a review by David and his colleague showing a meta-analysis of the 10 study with the pooled odds ratio of 2, but there was a strong evidence of publication bias. If we control for publication bias, but the pooled estimate is 1.6, showing that those with awkward posture are at higher risk by 60%. But you found no association between wrist posture and is it due to the fact that you control for high force and repetition, but other 10 studies didn't control for physical load?
So I think the question of posture, I think, is quite interesting. Again, in our study, we did not have a lot of workers who had high percentage of time in flexion or extension, so our cut points were fairly low. The review that you referenced, I think, was primarily cross-sectional studies. In these studies, there has been suggestion that, at least in some populations, that posture is a risk factor. And it may be that for lower force jobs, posture is a more important risk factor than it is for higher force jobs. I think what we know in this study is that once we controlled for force and for a repetition rate, the frequency of wrist posture, or the percent time spent in extension or flexion, was not a risk factor in our study. So, again, for low exposure populations, I don't think our study addresses that question, but I think your suggestion that maybe because we controlled for force is a good one. And there's certainly some experimental evidence, particularly that for heavy pinch, when the wrist is flexed, may be the risk factor. So it may be the combination of force and posture is important more so than the flexion itself.
Not sure if this is on. Okay.
It's on.
Yeah. Thanks, Brad. I appreciate your presentation. It was great. Really good work. My name is Scott Schneider. I'm with the Laborers Health and Safety Fund North America. I am a little concerned about the issue of vibration exposure, because we have a lot of members that are using vibrating hand tools, and because they're vibrating, they have to grip the tool a lot harder. So I don't know I'm not really familiar with the literature on vibration and carpal tunnel, but maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah, so this was, there has been, I think, a fair body of evidence and studies that have looked at working populations with high exposure to vibrating tools that has, I think, shown pretty strongly that vibration is a significant risk factor for carpal tunnel syndrome. In our study, we had a very crude measure of vibration. We weren't able to do the fairly complex metrics of amplitude and frequency that are really needed to do a good study of vibration. And again, I think we've been careful in the publications to say, and my apologies if I wasn't careful enough up here, is to say I think our study really says nothing about vibration. It doesn't give us useful information plus or against. So I would look to this other body of literature that's looked specifically at vibration.
I'm Mats Hagberg. Thank you, Brad,
Mats.
for excellent presentation. And I'm very curious for the future. You mentioned that you will maybe examine a little bit of functioning. And is it so that on the next PREMUS we will see some health economic data, because you could also compute both direct and indirect costs for the incident cases, right?
That's a great idea. So we have we did not collect cost data, although we have in several of the studies more we have functional data that could perhaps be extrapolated into costs. But I think we will be able to show changes in physical function that are related to these case definitions, and it depends on how sharp the pencils of the economists are, whether they would believe the cost extrapolations or not. Lex.
Alex Burnoff, Rotterdam. Thank you for your very good overview. If you pool these 6 studies, you get this kind of average at population level. And you have still this huge database with so many individuals. Could you make the next step and make a more individualized risk calculation, and then maybe even go to a more personalized prevention strategy? Because that seems to be, I think, a crucial issue here. Prevention is not a one-size-fits-all, and the risk is also not a one-size-fits-all. What are your ideas?
I don't think we've thought about doing sort of a personalized medicine approach to this, but that's a great idea. So combine personal and work exposures, and then you could estimate the attributable fraction on an individual, and then look at what the most important prevention initiatives would be. So we can't tell people to get older. Gender change, probably not possible, probably not effective for carpal tunnel syndrome. We can help people lose weight or help them remove force or repetition. So I think that's a good idea. I almost put up a slide showing a party in our office that had this enormous cake to ask whether this was also a risk factor for carpal tunnel syndrome. But I think as we move forward, I think merging approach to look at both personal, behaviors that are not specific to the work environment, as well as exposures and behaviors that are specific to the work environment in a more holistic way, I think is important for prevention.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Tommy Leubli from Zurich. Thank you for your presentation. And I think we should also discuss about intervention studies. So, of course, studies, but what intervention should we have more influence on the engineers, so that if something is very forceful and repetitive, it should be done by robots. And so we should discuss how to have enough salary for the workers, but for healthy workers, and if it's not healthy, we should have robots, so we should work together with engineers. What's your comment to this topic?
So I love engineers, so I think what these results point to is that there are a number of is that doing the work, the high force and high pinch that's required by some manufacturing and production jobs is the primary risk for carpal tunnel syndrome in these job types. There's certainly a lot of social issues with regard to increased mechanization and problems with how that affects the labor force. I think from this perspective of reducing carpal tunnel syndrome and probably also hand-wrist tendonitis and other disorders, reducing the duration of time that people spend in forceful grip and pinch, we should be finding ways to do that. And in some manufacturing processes, robots are an answer. In other jobs like food processing or some service work, it's harder to think of mechanization through robots as an issue, but there are other ways to reduce exposures. So, and again, I think this is one of the problems with a more holistic view of health, as Lex just suggested, is that we need to have people have enough physical activity to stay healthy and not too much that they get injured. And I think it's the challenge of doing that differs somewhat from industry to industry. Ben?
Yeah, hi. Ben Amick, Institute for Work and Health. I've always been persuaded by Barb Silverstein's early paper where she showed this exposure effect, but then an independent effect of the plants in which she was observing things. Right. And that always told me that something else was going on. And I think in the history of this research, we kind of then moved from measuring physical exposures to thinking, well, if we measure psychosocial exposures, then we've captured a lot of that other thing, whatever it is. And I think we believe it's something to do with how work is organized. But it seems to me that even just looking at the psychosocial exposures is probably not enough if we're really thinking about interventions. Because there's other things going on inside an employer. And so right. I was wondering if, just to provoke you a little, if you were to measure other things that are going on that you think may be influencing these production systems, what would you like to measure?
Right. So something we didn't measure was safety climate or safety culture in these studies. And I think you're right. I think that individual level psychosocial measures done with the standard measures probably does not fully capture what's happening in a plant. That probably matters a bit for the incidence of cases, although maybe not so much for the approach we did, which was more symptoms and nerve conduction. Probably matters much more for lost time, productivity, yeah. And I think matters a lot for interventions. And so I think once we get up to trying to make changes, then I think the organization, the culture, the willingness of an employer to first acknowledge the problem and then to do something about it varies wildly from employer to employer. So I think I'm looking forward to tomorrow's keynote where Linda Goldenhar is going to talk about safety culture and safety climate, and I think that's a real key to moving forward with interventions.
Thank you.
Susan.
Hi, Brad. Thanks very much for a great talk. Susan Stock, Quebec Institute of Public Health. I want to go to the issue of gender. Did anyone in your group do any stratified gender analysis? Do you have enough numbers to see whether the relationships are actually the same for each gender between exposure and outcome?
Right. So that's been done in some of the individual studies. I think Sue Burt looked at that with the NIOSH data. I don't think that we've done that yet with the pooled consortium data. So I'm looking at David. David's looking at Carissa. Carissa's looking at Anne-Marie and trying to figure out, it's like, did we actually do that? So if we haven't, we certainly will.
Okay.
Okay. So thanks for your attention, and thanks for more than 20 years of sort of community and comradeship at this meeting.
Thanks, Brad. Brad, don't leave. Don't leave. I want to thank you. That was a great way to start the conference off. Thanks so much. That was brilliant. And as a small token, here's some wonderful Canadian chocolates.
Excellent. Thank you.
We're on break now for the next 30 minutes.